Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to Painless Universal Conversation with myself, Anne Welsh. Today, we'll change your mind on the way you view your own suffering and pain, and how can you find your joy out of it. My guest will just be telling her own journey. Pastor Kemi is a wonderful guest, and I'm so excited she's taking her time out of her busy schedule to speak to us today. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about who she is. She is the wife of Jubilee Church Senior Pastor Tope Koleoso. Through a God-given vision, Kemi founded the Courageous Conference, and out of the conference, the Courageous Sisters Project was formed, an initiative that seeks to restore dignity to women across the world. Her mother left when she was a child, and her father remarried a woman who didn't care about them as children. She talks about the trauma that she carried throughout her teenage years and how an encounter with God in the midst of all her pain and suffering changed her. She was born in London to Nigerian parents. She was 5 when her dad moved back to Nigeria, leaving her and her mother, an older brother and younger sister in England. But then her mother decided to send them back to their father on a couple. A 10-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old traveling on their own to a place they've never been to meet a man, frankly, they didn't know. I'm excited because she'll be telling us about her own journey, what that meant when she met her father, and the impact of the pain of not knowing him cost on them. We'll be discussing the impact of meeting God, finding a new vocation, serving God as a family, forgiveness and reconciliation, discovering a new passion, and many more. Meet my wonderful guest, Pastor Kemi. Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to Painless Universal Conversation with myself, Anne Welsh. If you're new to the Painless Universal platform, this conversation today would be for you. It doesn't matter what religion you are, who you are, just finding your faith and knowing how to utilize that finding of your faith to guide you in the right path. This is really what this whole conversation is about, is how can we find our faith and utilize it to find our purpose in life. Pastor Kemi will be telling us about her own journey, how she got started on this journey, because most often we see pastors or we see religious leaders and we just think it was just so easy for them to come out and give you that word and beautiful words of wisdom that you want to hear. She'll be telling you about her own journey and why she believes that if we are able to navigate our own purpose, we could find our joy. How are you, Pastor Kemi? How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
And now I'm really delighted that you've taken time out of your busy schedule. I've seen a lot of your work, the work you and your husband do for massive and many youths, especially, how you've helped bring them together, how you congregate people, and try and inspire people through different ways of your life. One of the things you've done, you were born in London to Nigerian parents. So we'll be talking a little bit about that journey, how that inspired you, what, especially having Nigerian parents and living in the United Kingdom. People always wonder because they still, as much as they live here, they still have that upbringing where they still cannot leave the Nigeria behind. And also your work with encouraging the youngsters, the youth especially, in bettering themselves. But before we get started into any of that, who are you?
Great, big question. So yeah, I am Kemi. I'm married to Tope. We lead a church in London. I've got 2 sons, 2 adult sons. And I would often describe myself as an introvert who has had to learn to be an extrovert by virtue of just growing up really shy, but just looking at where I am today and being able to speak to people by the grace of God. I don't know how, but it's something that I've just realized that actually I've learned along the way.
Yes. It is true, because that was my struggle initially, to be able to go out there and speak to people and have that boldness. And it takes a long time to acquire that skills, and sometimes it comes through our circumstances because our environment pushes us out there. Yeah. When you look back as a child growing up, can you just tell us a little bit about your background? What was it like growing up as a child?
So my childhood, so like you said, I was born in London to Nigerian parents. And from the word go, I was really ill. So I had a congenital heart defect, which meant that when I was born, my mum was told that there was a 50% chance that I wouldn't survive. So my first year of life, I've been told, was spent in hospital. I was in hospital for a whole year because I was quite small. They couldn't operate, and eventually they did operate. And yeah, I live to tell the story of what other people have told me. And so that was really that's how life started for me. And I think when you are that ill as a kid, growing up with my mom, she was so cautious around me. So I was not allowed to do anything. So I think that contributed to me being very shy and very cautious, you know, not being able to talk to strangers, because it was always, oh no, don't do that, you know, your heart's not strong, and can't do that, your heart's not strong. So those were my early sort of growing up. And then my dad, so it was mum and dad, and I don't really remember dad that much in the early days. He moved back to Nigeria after he finished his studies, which is what a lot of Nigerians were doing then. And so mum was left to bring us up. So there were 3 of us at that time. And I just remember things always being tight. And at some point, I went into foster care, not as a result of neglect or anything like that, but I think it was almost like she couldn't cope with all 3 of us. So my brother and I went into foster care for a bit, and then returned back to her. And then, yeah, we sort of tried to make the best. I mean, she was working 3 jobs and trying really hard to bring up 3 kids on her own. And I know it could not have been easy. So those were my earliest memories that I can think of, yeah.
Oh, that's honestly, you know, looking at you so strong now. I'm glad you talked about the heart defect, because a lot of people who are going through that process right now, especially young mothers having kids or parents having kids that have heart defect, they tend to lose hope. Can you tell us what it was like for your parents who were having you? How did they find this hope in them when they thought you only had 50% chance of surviving? What did they do differently that gave them that hope that they could make it, that you would make it?
Um, Honestly, I don't think that they thought I would make it through. To be honest, I think when I remember just talking to my mum, and she describes once having to leave me in the hospital, having been told that if they don't operate, then I was definitely going to die, and the operation was only a 50% chance of survival. And she describes just leaving the hospital in floods of tears and not realizing that she'd walked into the middle of the road. And the bus that she was about to take was actually, the driver recognized her from having come to the hospital every single day and taken the same bus. And he literally stopped the bus in the middle of the road and helped her get on the bus. And I think one of the things that really got her through was just her support system, just family and friends around her, and just trying, you know, she had a faith, she did pray. So I believe she said she prayed very hard. So I'm thinking, you know, those things got her through, but I think it was touch and go for a long time. Even up until I was about 5 years old, they were still not 100% sure that I was fit enough to do what an average 5-year-old or 6-year-old would do.
Yeah. So, did you ever have to go back to live in Nigeria? Because most Nigerians, when you know, including myself, when you get to a certain age, you have to always move back, because our parents always think this is the way to encourage the culture. Did you ever have to do that as a child growing up?
Absolutely, yeah. So, like I said, my dad at some point went back to Nigeria, so it was mum and us, and then I think she just decided it was time we had to go to Nigeria. So she packed our bags. There were 3 of us, and she sent us to Nigeria unaccompanied. I mean, we were 10, 6, and 3, and so here we were at the airport. You know, she handed us over to some official. I remember she was some man she saw, and she sort of, because we're Yorubas, and she spoke Yoruba to him and gave him £10 and said, could you look after my children? And the minute she was out of sight, he disappeared. So we were left wandering around. So we get on the plane on our own. I mean, the air stewards then were fantastic. They settled us in and everything, and landed in Nigeria, to a country I did not know, to a man I barely knew. It was in the middle of rainy season. We stepped off the flight into a puddle of water. And that was my welcome to Nigeria. So yes, I ended up in Nigeria. I spent 15 years in Nigeria, actually, so most of my schooling was done in Nigeria. But yeah, I mean, no one even explained to me things like the sounds, the crickets, and at night they were just chirping noises, and I was like really scared. And then I saw a wall gecko and freaked out because I thought it was a baby crocodile, and it was just it was one thing after the other, but I survived it. I lived to tell the tale.
I love that. So how did you find, when you look back at it, how did you find the mental strength to help bring up your younger sibling? Because you are presumably, you were the older one in Nigeria when your mom left. So how did you find that mental strength to keep this thing going? Because you had other people looking up to you.
Just to put a little bit of context to it. So I'm the second born, so I have an older brother, myself and my younger sister. So 3 of us were born in London, and then we now had another brother born in Nigeria when my mum eventually came to meet us after about a year and a bit. She came to Nigeria. So there were 4 of us. And at the age of 9, I was involved in a massive car accident. So for the second time in my life, my mom was being told this girl's not going to survive. But again, you know, I pulled through. And then at the age of 12, I came home one day and we just found out, just to cut a long story short, my mom had just left. She just walked out without telling us. No conversation, nothing. It was just, we were just baffled by it. We asked our dad what was going on because we didn't know what was going on. I just knew mum wasn't around. And when I asked my dad just went, "Oh, your mother's gone." And that was it. And he wouldn't talk about it. So for 3 weeks, we didn't know where mum was. And this was like, I mean, I'm old. So this was like in the 80s or 70s, yeah, about then. And there were no mobile phones. So you couldn't ring and find out where she was. So I was left with these thoughts for 3 weeks as to what he meant by your mother's gone. Is she dead? Did she go back to London and stuff like that? So eventually we did find out that the marriage had broken down, but I think that kind of scarred me a little bit. And so our youngest brother, who was about 2 or 3, we were kind of left to look after him. I mean, it's a long story, but yeah, we were left to look after him. So you asked about the mental strength. I don't think it was more emotional tug than anything else, that I knew that, okay, I'm the big sister here. I need to look after my siblings. And so all 4 of us really just, I mean, I was 11 years older than him. So I effectively brought him up. Because once my mom left, my dad really didn't want to know about us. It was just like, we were just a disturbance in the house. So he wouldn't buy school uniforms. He wouldn't, I mean, it was just awful. It was neglect. I often say everywhere in this country would have been taken into care, definitely. So I ended up having to look after my younger siblings because I didn't want them to, you know, I would try and go to aunties and get money so that we can buy uniforms and school books and things like that. So it was really, I mean, I don't think I even thought about it. I just did it. But I think it was emotion as well, that I can't bear for my siblings to suffer. And at that young age, I mean, when my mom walked out, I was about 13. So I was still young myself. But you know, you just do what you need to do, I suppose.
I know. I think this is a unique thing about life. If you don't over science it, you just have to survive. And probably that gives you, that numbs the pain and just puts you in that survival mode and puts you in a position where I just have to get this going. I can't think about it. But when you help people who are going through similar pains right now, what are some of the things you advise someone, your younger self, to do to help bring joy to their household? You know, someone who's confused right now at home, feeling vulnerable, feeling lonely, feeling that everything is on them because their parents just can't care. What would you, if a young girl or young boy was watching this, what would you tell them to do to find that joy?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would tell them to do is actually speak to someone. You know, find somebody that you can confide in, because in the process of actually talking, it helps you just process your thoughts. I think what used to happen with me was everything was in my head. So even when my mum left, I went to school as if nothing had happened, and I was just going through the motions, and that was not good at all. And I think what I would say is that find somebody that you can trust, someone who you look up to, and just speak to them about how you're feeling. Because I don't think, I mean, the way that ours happened was particularly, it really was shocking, because it was 3 weeks of not knowing what was happening, what happened to your mum. And then after that, my dad was just like quite neglectful. But if I had had someone that I could have spoken to, maybe they could have actually reasoned with him or spoken to my mum. But so that's one of the things that I would say. But also I want to say to people, a lot of the time when you grow up in those situations, you almost have the mindset of, well, that's my life done now. I'm not going to achieve much. And you almost have to say to yourself, actually, whatever's happening right now is momentary. It's not going to last forever. And there is a way out. And that gives you the fighting spirit to say, actually, I am going to make it out of this situation, and I'm not going to let my present situation define my future. And I think that's important to get into your head, that it doesn't have to define who you're going to be going forward.
I love momentary, because it's true. It's very true. We think this is forever. Once we go through a deep pain, we always think this pain is going to last. There's no way out of this pain. Be it poverty pain, be it not being successful, losing your job. You always think, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to survive? But this is just a pain that is a momentary pain. We just need to learn how to live it and go through it steady, so we could be staying and get to the next joyful part of our life. And I love that about you. At 16, you decided you couldn't cope anymore. This is enough. I need to move on. I need to get to somewhere else.
I need to escape.
Why did you decide that this was time to let go of the whole thing?
There were a few things that happened. So one of the things was my younger sister, who was quite feisty and always talked back. She was so much bolder than I was, stood up to my dad one day, and he kicked her out the house, called her a bastard and kicked her out the house, and she was 13. So I was like, I first of all, I admired her boldness. I was like, I could never do that. Well, he actually got me thinking that actually I don't have to. I mean, it was awful that she got kicked out. But by the grace of God, she ended up with a teacher who was really kind, took her in and looked after her. So it's an awful story. But I looked at her and I thought, I need a bit of that. I need a bit of, just push back. And so there were some things that had happened. My dad was just being a bit unreasonable. And he gave me an ultimatum. He said, so in Nigeria, you could start university quite early. And one of the things that by God's grace, I was able to gain admission into university, but he wouldn't fund it. He didn't want to pay for the hostel fees. He didn't want to know about it. And so he said, go and stay with your uncle, who was nearby. I stayed there for a bit, and it was just awful. He was quite abusive. So I decided I can't do that. Went back to my dad, and he was like, you either stay there or that's it. You can't live here. And I said, right, fine. I will make my own way. And so I decided that was it. I wasn't going to ask him to help. I was just going to try and make my own way in life. So I went back to my friend. I walked out with a small bag, basically. There was stuff that was in my uncle's house. I never went back to that place again. Walked out of my dad's house. I told my mom, and she was like, how are you going to fend for yourself? And I said, don't worry, something will happen. And somehow friends and aunts and uncles that I would traipse around regularly, summer jobs, and I was just able to sort of look after myself.
Oh, wow. This is an amazing story. I'm so proud that at least you got out of there, that you were also smart enough to know that there's also danger outside in the world, but you found family and friends who were able to look after you, find that nest to to put your head, and people find kinder people to be with you. But something changed in your life. You decided to let God into your life, which is very rare. You did it at quite a young age. How did you, and where did you find God?
So I'd always believed in God, but not really had a relationship with God, if I can put it that way. And having walked out of my dad's house and certain things had sort of worked out for me, I got really I got this whole world thing sorted out. I know how this thing runs. I got really proud. I think that's the word, that, I survived this, I survived that. It was I, and I don't need my dad, and I don't need anyone. And it was that kind of attitude. But my brother had become a Christian. He kept preaching to me. And I said to him, look, I've got this far without God. I'm fine. But one day I was reflecting, and I was reflecting on when I was about to sit my GCSEs a few years before. I heard, because things were so bad at home, I knew that my one ticket out was education. If I could pass my GCSEs and get to university, it will get me somewhere in life. Because my dad always used to say to me, the best thing that can happen to you is for someone to marry you and take you off my hands. And when people say things like that to you, I mean, he had all kinds of things he used to say. He used to call me, he always used to say I was an idiot. I was dumb. And those words tend to sink in after a while. So you begin to believe that you're not good and you're rubbish. But one day I just thought, if only I could just pass my GCSEs. Now, after my mum left, my grades had plummeted. Nobody expected me to pass. So I wrote down on a piece of paper, I wrote, if I can get 5 GCSEs, they were called WIEC then, if I could get 5 papers, that is what I need to get into university, I'll serve you forever. So I folded it up and put it inside my pillowcase. And then a few years down the line of me doing life myself, I was reminded of that. And then I realized that every single thing that I thought was me was not me. I had been, because of the lack of a father figure or mum being around, I was in situations where I could have been taken advantage of. There were times when, it was this close and I managed to escape. There were times when I had absolutely no food and somehow a friend would say, oh, do you want to, come over and have a meal? I ended up living rent-free with friends, all these things. And then one day I was reflecting and I'm thinking, don't be stupid, Kemi. It wasn't you. You're not that wise. You're not that clever. I began to realize that actually God he is real. I always knew he was real, but actually he had his hand on my life. Yeah. And my brother came back one day and preached to me again. And I was like, okay. And I think he was more shocked than I was, because I'd already reached that point in my head that actually I need God in my life, because it's not me. Somebody has been looking after you, Kemi. So yeah, that's how I came to, give my life to Christ.
And when you accepted Christ in your life, what changed? What did you start noticing when because one thing is saying you found this process, but what did then change in your life when you finally accepted God in your life?
It wasn't, I think one of the things that changed was the peace. I think sometimes you don't realize how important peace is until you lose it. Or maybe you've never had it and then all of a sudden you realize you have it. There was something on the inside of me that was no longer striving. There wasn't that struggle that, oh my goodness, what's my future going to be like? I had this kind of, I'll be okay. I think I'll be okay. And I think that was the biggest change for me, that somehow on the inside, I knew that God's got me and things are going to work out. So I was able to it almost feels as if you just like exhale and there's a calm that comes over me. And I think that was the biggest difference. I wouldn't say, it's not like I knew my Bible straight away. It was a slow growth. But that's one of the things that I hold on to, is that I knew that I had the peace. I now know that it was a piece of God.
You also studied education, right? At university. And I'm thinking, what? Of all things, you studied education. What were you thinking when you chose education as a first degree? Were you trying to encourage other people about the life? Or what was it that was going through your mind?
Nothing that profound, I wish. Honestly, I studied education because I needed to get an education. I was like, okay, I am not, I've been told that I wasn't clever. And you cannot apply to university even before you got your results, I think, or something like that. So this was tactical. What is the university that's going to require the least amount of points? And what... I'm sorry if everyone thinks that there was some really deep meaning behind me studying education. What university requires the least amount of points, and what course can I do that's going to get me a job at the end of it? And as a result of that, I thought, yeah, I can do education. As a girl growing up, I'd teach my dolls and things like that. I think this will be okay. So that's how I applied for education, to be honest, and went off and did it. And I enjoyed it. And I believe there's nothing wasted in God's economy. Everything comes around and works out anyway. Yeah. And while I was there, I went for teaching practice. And honestly, I walked in front of a class. I was like, I hate this. I absolutely hate this. What am I doing here? But I knew I had to finish it. And so I finished it, got my degree in education, came back to England. And like I say, I actually got to finish university by the age of 20. So I was pretty young still. Yeah. And it wasn't the cleverest thing. It was quite hard to start off with, but came back to England and didn't want to teach, did not want to teach at all. But it's the only qualification I had, so ended up in sort of not a supply assistant teacher, like an teaching assistant over the summer. And that was my journey to education, but it came in handy later on.
That's really interesting, because I think a lot of work you do, the education part plays a big role into it. But before we go into the education part, when you returned back to England, you became a nurse specialist and you were helping people. Why is faith so important when people are coming to the end of their lives? Because as a nurse, you saw all sorts of things. And one of the things you tend to see are people who are going through that end process of their life. And I always say to people, and I just recently had a loss in my family, and I've seen it, that it plays a huge role in letting go and believing that that person is in a better place. Why do you think faith plays a huge role?
So yes, trained as a nurse and then specialized in end of life care. So dealt a lot with palliative and palliative care patients, and basically patients that have been told that there's no further cure. And I think faith, I mean, it's a very broad question. So what I'm going to try and do is just try and make it a little bit concise. So for every single person, we might not all be religious, but we all have a spirituality, because we are body, soul, and spirit. So even though you might not, say you're a Christian or whatever, you still have a spirituality. And that spirituality on the inside of you, as you come to the end of your life, you begin to grapple with existential questions like, what was the purpose? Why am I here? What's going to happen after I die? And so as a person comes towards death, questions like that become even more important. And so the role that I think faith plays, because when you come to the end of your life, you're searching for meaning. You're thinking, okay, I've lived, 80 years, 70 years. Unfortunately, some patients I looked after were younger, 30, 40. You're having to ask yourself, so what was it all about? And this is where faith helps you to answer those questions, so that as you come to the end of your life, there's no longer that kind of psychological distress as to, where am I going to end up? What's going to happen to me? Why was on this earth in the first place? And so when it comes to death, I often talk about death. We often see death as an end. But as a Christian, as a woman of faith, I say that it's an end with a bend. So yes, it's the end of your natural physical life as you know it, but actually there's eternity around the bend. And so having faith helps you to answer those questions of, what was my purpose on the face of the earth? And as a Christian, I can answer that, why was I here? And then what's going to happen? And then it gives you that idea that there's a hope beyond the grave, that this isn't it, that actually I get to live. Some people have struggled with chronic illness up until their end 5 days, and they know that actually when they leave this body, they're leaving this physical body of pain behind, and they're going to have a new body and be able to live a life without the pain and without all the psychological difficulties. And so faith helps you face your end of life probably with a different sense, with a different outlook. It doesn't make it easy, it just gives it meaning. A meaning that says, actually, it wasn't just, we're not just a puff of smoke here today, gone tomorrow, but actually we have a purpose and we are going somewhere afterwards. I hope that makes sense.
That makes so much sense. That's really beautiful, because it really summarized it in a sort of sweet way. And it just, I love when you said, you use people who are born with chronic illness, like people like myself, that you leave that pain behind and you go to a different place, and there, hopefully, where you go next, there'll be no pain there. And it's just a different way of looking at it, and it's something that then you come to terms with the end process of life in an easier way. So that's really good. I saw some of your talks. You're very in particular about forgiveness. It's something you talk so often about. Why do you think it's important that we forgive? You know, you've gone through your own pain with your parents, what they, you know, how your dad handled things. How do you think it's important to forgive people that may have hurt us in the past?
I mean, the one person that I had to really come to forgive was my mom. And that took a long time. And I then realized actually it was really important for me to do that. And I'll tell you why. But first of all, the reason why people don't forgive is because they think they're letting that person off the hook. You know, you don't forgive because you think that, okay, if I forgive that person, then they get off scot-free. Well, actually, unforgiveness is not so much about the person who hurt you, it's about you. Unforgiveness is really about you, because along with unforgiveness comes, you know, you think that you are binding that person, but actually you're binding yourself, if that makes any sense. So with unforgiveness comes a lot of baggage. It does not travel alone. It travels with anger, it travels with resentment, it travels with bitterness. And these things begin to define who you are. It begins to distort your identity. I've often seen people who find it difficult to forgive, and they begin to project what God never intended them to be. So unforgiveness is very much about yourself. That's why I love what Nelson Mandela said. He said that when you walk with unforgiveness, it's like you drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. It's poisoning you. So that's why it's important. It's not that it is easy, but it is necessary. It's necessary so that you can walk freely. I think it's one of those things where they talk about that to be able to forgive somebody is enlightened self-interest. So it's not about that person, it's about you, and you being able to say, okay, that's it. I'm not going to let bitterness and anger and all these things occupy me. I'm going to let that person go free.
I love that. It's true, because what's the point of drinking the poison and you thinking someone else is going to die? It's just for your own sanity, to find your own, to be free again. Because when you I think I always say to people, when you hold grudge, when you're not forgiven, it's heavy on the soul as well, because it's constantly in your mind, and the person is constantly, you're constantly reminded of that person. But when you let it go, when you forgive and you know, you might not forget because you need to keep those lessons from it, but it's also best just to forgive and let it go, so you can move on with your life and find different ways of joy, because there's so many things out there in the world apart from this one thing that could give you a source of joy. You don't want to have that blessing.
And sometimes the person that you're harboring unforgiveness towards doesn't even know.
Yeah.
So they're walking free, and you're like dealing with all this stuff in your head. So yeah, it's so true.
Oh, that's the worst one then. Yeah, it's such the worst one. True. What are some of the best steps a person can take? You know, when you start that healing, you decide to start forgive. What are some of the steps you could tell a person to start that healing process? Because to heal is very difficult. To heal from the sins they've committed or you've committed, and start their reconciliation process. How do you encourage people to do that?
And I think this is really important. So I do, you know, we've just had a laugh about unforgiveness, but it's really difficult to let things go. And so whenever I speak to people about how do you heal, how do you move on, I often really talk about 5 main things. And I think the first thing is to identify the problem. Sit down and think, okay, who hurt you and what exactly did they do? Because sometimes over the years, things get so muddled in your head that actually it's helpful to just think, okay, why am I so angry about this person? Why is this particular issue hurting me? So you identify what was it, who was it, how has it made you feel? And then the next thing you need to do is you actually need to talk to someone about it. And I say talk to someone because it's in talking, you're actually processing things out. You can hear, you know, as you're speaking to someone, it's helping you to process whatever it is that had happened. And when I say speak to someone, don't just choose any old person who's going to be talking your business all over the place. Find someone who is, counseling helps, or find someone who is has integrity, who's not going to, who's not going to, talk to you about, you should have done this and you should have done that. So it's about being wise about who you talk to, and just allow them to help you process whatever it is that you have gone through. And then the next thing is to, and this sounds quite crazy, but it's actually to have a real desire to want to be healed. Sometimes we don't want to be healed because that thing has become our identity. Is that thing, I was listening to a podcast recently about a guy who had an alcohol addiction. And one of the reasons that he didn't want to go to therapy was because he didn't really want to face the person who he was without that addiction. And so he didn't really desire the healing. That's true. So sometimes people can be a bit worried as to, I've had this grudge for so long. Actually, I don't really want to let it go. So you actually have to need to say to yourself, actually, I really want to be healed, but count the cost as well. Because the cost could be that you have to forgive someone. Are you ready to do that? The cost could be that actually you've got to cancel that person's debt. You need to be ready to do that. There's no point saying, okay, I want to heal from this, and still harboring something on the corner there saying, okay, I can't let this thing go. And then the next thing I would say, as a Christian, I would say pray through the whole process. Pray through the whole process, because it's not easy. And then finally, you have to decide that actually I'm going to move on. And in moving on, you're saying to that person, either I'm going to let you go.
You're now a pastor and a counselor, and this is something that is really amazing, because you've taken your journey of your pain and incorporated it into your new life of being a pastor, helping others. And in this journey, one of the things that fascinates me a lot is you did the Courage Conference, and another thing you do is the dignity to women across the world. There's something called the dignity. Yes, you do that, and this is something where one of our biggest things is women are always talking about pain, and you help a lot of women in your church, your community, to go through whatever journey they're going through and helping them find their joy. What are some of your key messages you tend to share when you give these lectures and these counseling to these women?
I think one of the things I always often tell people is that we all have scars, we all have pains, we all have wounds. I don't think you can live on the face of the earth for so many years and not carry something. And I think it's important for people to hear that, because often you think you're the only one dealing with whatever it is you're dealing with. And yes, what is a Goliath to a person is a Goliath to the person, but actually helping people understand that it is not unusual to come so far and not carry something with you. And one of the things I help them see is that it just depends on what's leading you. Are you allowing the hurt to lead you? Are you allowing bitterness to lead you? Or in my case, are you allowing God to lead you? And so when I counsel women, when I help women, what I'm saying to them is actually, if at the foundation I can help you to know God, then out of that, it begins to sort out your identity issues. You can then begin to sort out your purpose. You can then begin to sort out that being able to sort of walk in the forgiveness and being able to realize that actually there's so much more in store for you. So for me, it's always about, okay, what's your relationship with God? And then out of that, let's begin to talk about, because it's in Christ you're going to find your identity. It's in Christ that you're going to recognize what your purpose is. So that's really, and also sharing my own pain with them, my journey of pain. And I think sometimes when they look at me, and if I sit down and say, look, I've been through this, this and that, they go, wow, if you can go through that and survive it, then I think I can as well. And then helping them recognize that actually, but I didn't do it on my own. And so hoping that, that, and walking them through it as well, because it is a journey.
That's true. That's really true. Helping them find that peace, that journey, but most importantly is understanding that you've been through it, you've come out, and you've been scarred. Because a lot of times we see individuals and we're so taken aback by them. We think they're just nothing has touched them, that they're just this miraculous person, not realizing they've been through their own scar. And if they could share their journey, then you realize your own journey is actually not that bad, that you actually can go through it because of this other person has just shown you a pathway to get by. So I love that about your work. Finally, before we, I have to ask you this question about this big project you're doing, the sister project, Courageous Sister Project. You started this, and you were looking to really embrace women, encourage them. How is this project going, and what's your hope for the future with this project you're doing?
It was going well until COVID. It was like, like when something's got momentum and then all of a sudden COVID happens, you're like, okay, what do we do now? So really what it's about is helping women in less advantaged situations have dignity. And so through the project, so it's really kind of, I lead the women's ministry here at church called Courage Sisterhood. And then from Courage Sisterhood, we have conferences. And then really it's sort of I don't want to do things that are just spiritual. I want to put my hand to the plow and say, actually, where can we make a difference? And so going to women who I know haven't had a best start in life and saying to them, first of all, you can do it. And so that's always the basics. It's like I share my own story. I help them see how through Christ I was able to do this. And then helping them with business startups, education funds, things like healthcare. And so really I'm looking at women, not just in third world countries. So for instance, in the UK, what we did a few years ago was just partner with the food bank and have sort of products for women's health and just bag them. And, because a lot of women, if you can't afford food, then what else is it that you can't afford? So it's really restoring dignity in that kind of way where, so for instance, we do a lot of work with a girls' hostel in Zambia, in Lusaka. And these are girls who would normally not go to school because there's no school in their village. So they travel into a town and they stay there, and they were staying in such awful circumstances. They were being raped and misused and abused and things like that. So TF Fund built a hostel, and we fund girls to stay in that hostel because I'm a great believer from my own life, how education helps lift you up. So making sure that these girls actually have an education. So we have about something like 30 to 40 girls that we were sponsoring to finish their what is sort of primary school. And then a couple of girls have gone on to university, which I'm so happy about. So one of them is doing nursing, and so we're able to fund her, and it just makes a difference. Also, they have this thing, they say that I'm just a girl child, and I'm like, you're not just a girl child, you're a daughter of the Most High God. You can be who God created you to be. But it's not enough for me to just say it. I need to actually put some money behind it. So we live in the West, and we're so privileged. So when we have our conferences, we raise money and we use it to bless other women.
Anyone who's looking to hear your beautiful words, listen to you, what you do. I mean, just listening to you myself, I felt so taken back, and I always obviously have to come and see you someday because it was just amazing, your kind words. Anyone who wants to join your work, how can they find you?
So they can find me at, I'm on social media, Kemi Koleoso, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but also if they go to www.jubileecourageconference.com, they can see all the work that the Courage Sisterhood does there.
I would definitely be sharing that. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to this, having this wonderful conversation with you. Pastor Kemi, you're amazing and you shine a light. I think your pain, yes, you went through enormous amount of pain, but you've utilized that pain to really help a lot of other people who might be going through it in their own ways. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. It really has.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.